The concept of the wounded healer has long captivated the human imagination, surfacing in myths, legends, spiritual traditions, and psychology. The archetype speaks to a universal truth: suffering itself can become a powerful catalyst for profound personal transformation and the capacity to heal others. To be a wounded healer is not merely to endure pain, it is to embrace suffering as a conduit for empathy, wisdom, and service to humanity. Across cultures and time periods, the figure of the wounded healer appears again and again, whether in the form of the mythic centaur Chiron in ancient Greek tradition, or in the insights of the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, who recognized that one's personal wounds can become gateways to self-knowledge and compassion. The wounded healer archetype in myth and culture. The archetype of the wounded healer is as old as human storytelling itself. In ancient myths and folktales around the world, we encounter figures who bear personal injuries yet possess extraordinary power to heal others. These stories suggest that deep suffering often confers on individuals a mystical ability to understand and alleviate the pain of those around them. Chiron, the mythic healer. One of the earliest and most influential representations of the wounded healer archetype is found in ancient Greek mythology, embodied by the centaur Chiron. Chiron was renowned for his wisdom, knowledge of medicine, and skill in the healing arts. Despite his abilities, Chiron suffered a tragic wound when he was accidentally struck by an arrow dipped in the venom of the Hydra. Because he was immortal, Chiron could not die, leaving him in perpetual agony. Yet, instead of succumbing to despair, Chiron channeled his suffering into deep empathy and mastery of the healing arts. He became a revered mentor to many Greek heroes, including Asclepius, the god of medicine. Chiron's story illustrates how profound suffering can forge an intimate understanding of pain, prompting individuals to discover remedies that not only ease their own agony but also serve humanity. His paradoxical status, wounded yet immortal, healer yet in need of healing, makes him a quintessential symbol of how personal affliction can enhance empathy and skill in healing others. The Shamanic tradition. While Chiron offers a glimpse of the wounded healer in Greek mythology, shamanic traditions worldwide highlight similar figures who endure trials of illness, psychological turmoil, or near-death experiences that grant them shamanic power. In many indigenous cultures, shamans are chosen not simply because they seek the role but because they undergo profound crises, such as severe sickness, madness, or spiritual emergencies, that ultimately lead them to mastery over the spirit world. For shamans, the wounding may be literal or figurative, but in either case, it opens the door to an unseen realm. Rather than rejecting their suffering, shamans integrate it as a necessary rite of passage that transforms them into intermediaries between the human world and spiritual dimensions. Through their personal ordeal, they learn the contours of illness, pain, and healing from the inside out, enabling them to guide others through analogous experiences. The shamanic narrative, like Chiron's myth, demonstrates how deeply personal suffering often serves as an initiation into profound healing capabilities. Carl Jung and the psychological understanding of the wounded healer. Carl Jung's concept of the wounded healer emerged from his personal struggles and his understanding of the psychotherapeutic relationship. After parting ways with Sigmund Freud, Jung underwent a period of intense introspection and psychological turmoil, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. During this time, he experienced vivid dreams, visions, and emotional distress, which eventually led to many of his seminal insights about the psyche, archetypes, and the collective unconscious. Jung recognized that his own experiences of disorientation, fear, and despair sharpened his empathy for his patients. In navigating his own wound, he discovered the necessity of confronting one's shadow, the darker, unacknowledged aspects of personality, in order to achieve psychological integration. Jung's personal ordeal underscored that transformation can only occur when we face, rather than avoid, our pain. One of Jung's enduring contributions is the idea that a psychotherapist or analyst, in confronting their own wounds, is better equipped to assist patients. He believed that the analyst's self-examination and personal healing are critical to understanding the patient's process. If a therapist has not grappled with their own unconscious material, they risk projecting their unresolved issues onto clients or failing to recognize deeper patterns in the patient's psyche. This concept is not limited to professional therapists. It resonates with anyone in a helping role. Teachers, counselors, mentors, and friends all benefit from recognizing and integrating their own woundedness, as it fosters authentic empathy. In this sense, Jung's insight speaks to the universal nature of the wounded healer archetype, that we can only truly guide others through terrains of suffering if we have walked similar paths ourselves. Shadow work and integration. Central to Jung's framework is the notion of the shadow, representing aspects of ourselves we deny or repress because they are painful, shameful, or socially unacceptable. Often, our wounds are entangled with these shadow elements. By integrating them, acknowledging them, understanding them, and finding a healthy expression for them, we free ourselves from unconscious patterns that perpetuate suffering. For the wounded healer, this involves not only addressing personal trauma, but also understanding how those scars can become resources for insight. The process is dynamic and requires ongoing commitment. Jung's conception of individuation, a lifelong journey of becoming who we truly are, demands that we repeatedly encounter and embrace wounded aspects of ourselves until they transform into wisdom, compassion, and creative energy. Suffering as a gateway to transformation. At the heart of the wounded healer archetype is the recognition that suffering itself can be a catalyst for profound change. This is not a romanticized ideal of pain. Rather, it reflects a psychological and spiritual truth that often our deepest growth emerges from enduring and transcending trials. Suffering occupies a paradoxical position in human life. On one hand, people generally seek to avoid pain and pursue happiness. On the other, history and human experience show that significant personal development frequently arises from hardship. Illness, trauma, loss, and heartbreak all expose the fragility of the human condition, undermining our defenses and illusions. Yet, in that exposure lies a unique opening for transformation. When our usual coping mechanisms fail in the face of trauma, the psyche is forced to reconfigure. Much like how a muscle grows stronger by repairing micro-tears caused by exertion, the self can become more integrated by confronting and assimilating the aspects of reality we once avoided. The wounded healer's journey exemplifies this paradox. Pain breaks us open so that we might be remade in a more holistic, compassionate form. Alchemy of the soul. Mystics and philosophers have long viewed suffering as an alchemical process, one that burns away impurities to reveal our true nature. In the crucible of suffering, the ego's illusions about invulnerability or self-sufficiency dissolve. Old patterns, false identities, and defenses are stripped away. What remains is a raw confrontation with the depths of existence, compelling us to ask questions about who we are and why we suffer. For the wounded healer, this alchemical process has a collective dimension. The transformation is not solely for personal betterment. It becomes the fertile ground from which empathy and a desire to serve others arise. Just as the alchemist transforms base metals into gold, the wounded individual transforms personal despair into wisdom and compassion. Contemporary psychology has a term for this phenomenon: post-traumatic growth. Researchers studying trauma survivors have found that many individuals, after enduring challenging events, report enhanced personal strength, more meaningful relationships, and a deeper appreciation for life. While not everyone experiences growth from suffering, and suffering in itself is never guaranteed to yield positive change, the possibility exists that pain can become a gateway to a richer, more empathetic life experience. The wounded healer is a living testament to the reality of post-traumatic growth. Rather than wallowing in self-pity or becoming embittered, the wounded healer uses suffering as an impetus to expand the heart and mind. This dynamic interplay between heartbreak and hope underscores the paradoxical nature of pain. It can shatter illusions, but also pave the way for a rebirth that is more genuine and loving. The spiritual significance of the wounded healer. While the psychological perspective illuminates the inner mechanics of the wounded healer, the spiritual dimension of this archetype runs equally deep. Throughout human history, spiritual traditions have recognized that embracing suffering can lead to transcendent states of compassion, insight, and oneness. Many religious traditions offer powerful illustrations of the wounded healer's spiritual resonance. In Christianity, Jesus Christ embodies the archetype in his willingness to suffer for humanity's redemption. His wounds, inflicted during the crucifixion, symbolically become channels for divine grace, healing the separation between God and humankind. Through his suffering, Christ demonstrates radical love and empathy for all beings. Likewise, in Buddhism, the Bodhisattva figure forgoes personal liberation to remain in the cycle of rebirth until all sentient beings are freed from suffering. Bodhisattvas accept the pain of the world out of compassion, embodying the principle that one's own liberation is intertwined with the liberation of all. Their willingness to endure suffering is not passive resignation. Rather, it is an active stance of compassion that transforms suffering into spiritual evolution. Both Christ and the Bodhisattva exemplify the spiritual dimension of the wounded healer, the recognition that suffering can be transformed into a force for universal compassion. These sacred figures invite us to see pain not as a barrier to divinity but as a potential gateway to unconditional love. Dark Night of the Soul. Many spiritual practitioners recount experiences reminiscent of the dark night of the soul, a term famously associated with the 16th century mystic Saint John of the Cross. It describes an intense period of spiritual desolation and inner turmoil when one feels forsaken by God or cut off from the comfort of faith. Although harrowing, the dark night of the soul is often portrayed as a necessary passage leading to profound spiritual awakening. In this sense, the dark night mirrors the wounded healer's journey. The individual embraces deep suffering and confusion, moving through it rather than fleeing. On the other side of such trials often lies a renewed relationship to the divine, marked by humility and awe. The one who emerges from the dark night bears the scars of suffering but also carries spiritual insight and the capacity to guide others who find themselves in similar darkness. Across spiritual traditions, we see the recurring theme of suffering as initiation. Whether through ritualistic ordeals, vision quests, or monastic austerities, spiritual seekers have recognized that traversing pain can lead to revelation. Embracing suffering is not an end unto itself. Rather, it is an avenue for stripping away superficial desires and illusions, thereby enabling direct communion with the sacred. For the wounded healer, this initiatory aspect is deeply personal. Their suffering is not merely theoretical or symbolic, it is lived, yet it is precisely that lived pain, fully embraced, that becomes the crucible for spiritual development. In their compassion for others' anguish, in their willingness to stand as a guide or a balm, the wounded healer reflects the universal principle of suffering as a doorway to deeper spiritual truth. Embracing suffering in everyday life. While the archetypal discussions of the wounded healer might seem lofty, the principle of embracing suffering finds relevance in everyday contexts. Whether one is a teacher, parent, healthcare professional, or simply a compassionate neighbor, the willingness to acknowledge and integrate personal wounds can become a source of empathy and community building. Compassion emerges naturally when we are acquainted with our own pain. Instead of judging those who struggle, we resonate with their plight, remembering how it feels to hurt. This empathy can disarm defenses and foster genuine human connection. In everyday interactions, the wounded healer stance encourages listening without judgment, offering help without condescension, and seeing the spark of humanity in each person, regardless of their flaws or failures. Embracing suffering also cultivates resilience. Life inevitably presents challenges, economic hardships, health crises, relationship breakdowns, and more. When we have integrated our own wounds, we become less fearful of adversity. The wounded healer perspective teaches that pain, though difficult, is survivable and can lead to deeper wisdom. This mindset fosters psychological flexibility, enabling us to adapt constructively when faced with the unexpected. In a culture often obsessed with displaying polished facades, admitting personal pain can be a radical act. Yet vulnerability begets authenticity. When we share aspects of our woundedness, appropriately and with safe boundaries, we invite others to do the same, laying the groundwork for genuine intimacy. We see this dynamic in support groups, spiritual communities, and close friendships. The wounded healer archetype in everyday life thus breaks down the isolation that often accompanies suffering, opening a channel for shared healing. The challenges and dangers of embracing suffering. While the journey of the wounded healer can yield deep insight and compassion, it also bears certain risks. Embracing suffering is not a casual endeavor. Without discernment, healthy boundaries, and community support, the wounded individual may spiral into unhealthy patterns. One potential pitfall is conflating the wounded healer's call with martyrdom. Some individuals may interpret the embrace of suffering as a license to neglect self-care, viewing ongoing pain or sacrifice as inherently virtuous. This attitude can lead to burnout, chronic stress, and even mental health crises. True wounded healers distinguish between healthy acceptance of pain and an unhealthy fixation on it, ensuring they practice self-compassion alongside service to others. For those in helping professions, nurses, therapists, social workers, the wounded healer archetype might be both an asset and a liability. While personal experience with suffering can enhance empathy, it can also render one more susceptible to compassion fatigue. Taking on others' pain repeatedly without proper self-care can lead to emotional exhaustion. This underscores the importance of boundaries, self-reflection, and restorative practices. On the spiritual front, the notion of embracing suffering can sometimes veer into spiritual bypassing, where individuals use spiritual ideas to avoid addressing underlying psychological issues. For instance, someone might frame their unprocessed trauma as a spiritual lesson, without actually doing the difficult emotional work to heal. The genuine wounded healer path is not about glossing over or glamorizing pain. It is about integrating it thoroughly, which demands honest self-inquiry and, often, therapeutic support. Intergenerational healing. The notion of the wounded healer also illuminates intergenerational healing. Families pass down trauma patterns, whether from abusive cycles, forced migration, or cultural displacement. Yet these families can also birth members who, through consciousness and effort, break the cycle. Such individuals may confront the family's hidden pain, disrupt harmful patterns, and offer new models of wholeness for future generations. Seen from this vantage point, personal healing is never truly personal. When one member of a lineage embraces their suffering and transforms it, they create a ripple effect that can uplift the entire family system. The wounded healer's journey thus radiates outward, dissolving historical burdens and nurturing fresh possibilities. On a global scale, the principle of the wounded healer can inspire collective responses to urgent crises, such as climate change, refugee displacement, and public health emergencies. When communities and leaders recognize that pain is shared and that each crisis reveals deeper lessons about interdependence, solutions can become more compassionate and holistic. Instead of scapegoating or denial, a global wounded healer ethos would acknowledge that humanity's wounds demand collaborative healing and that no community thrives at the expense of another's suffering. The wounded healer's gift. The wounded healer archetype speaks to a central paradox of human existence. Our greatest sources of anguish can become our greatest sources of wisdom and empathy, if we dare to face and integrate them. Through mythic narratives like Chiron's, psychological frameworks like Carl Jung's, and spiritual teachings found in traditions around the world, we learn that pain has transformative potential. Embracing suffering, in this sense, is neither masochistic nor passive. It is a conscious choice to meet pain rather than flee it, to glean insights from anguish rather than succumb to bitterness. The wounded healer recognizes that each scar can serve as a bridge to the suffering of others, opening channels of deep compassion that words alone cannot convey. Whether by offering a listening ear, performing acts of service, or advocating for justice, the wounded healer transforms personal affliction into communal benefit. Furthermore, the wounded healer's journey is ongoing, a cycle of healing and rehealing that continually refines the soul's capacity for empathy and love. It is a reminder that perfection is not the goal of the spiritual or psychological quest. Wholeness is. and wholeness emerges when we reconcile our broken parts.